Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. Ever since I was a kid, I've heard whispers about the peculiar habits of my grandpa. Family gatherings were filled with hushed conversations about his eccentricity, but one story always stood out. The tale of the Ouija board he supposedly buried in our front yard. It sounded ridiculous, like one of those spooky legends you tell around a campfire. But as I grew older, curiosity gnawed at me. My grandpa passed away when I was 7. I remember his gruff voice, the scent of tobacco clinging to his clothes, and the way his eyes would twinkle mischievously whenever someone brought up the supernatural. After his death, my parents inherited his old house. We moved in, and life went on, but the story of the buried Ouija board never left my mind. One dreary autumn afternoon, a burst of morbid curiosity overtook me. I was 16, bored, and seeking a thrill. I grabbed a shovel from the garage and headed to the front yard. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy shadow over the house, and a cold wind whispered through the trees, almost as if nature was warning me to turn back. But I was determined. I started digging near the old oak tree where Grandpa used to sit and smoke his pipe. The ground was tough, roots snaking through the soil, making the task arduous. Sweat trickled down my forehead despite the chill in the air. My muscles ached, but I kept going, driven by an inexplicable urge. After what felt like hours, the shovel struck something hard. My heart pounded in my chest as I cleared away the dirt, revealing a wooden box, worn and weathered by time. It was small, just big enough to fit a Ouija board. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Inside, nestled in a bed of tattered cloth, lay the board. It looked ancient, its edges frayed and the letters faded. The planchette, a small heart-shaped piece of wood, sat beside it. A shiver ran down my spine as I lifted the board from its resting place. It felt heavy, not just physically, but with an ominous weight that seemed to seep into my bones. I took it inside, brushing off the dirt and debris. The house was eerily quiet. My parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone. I set the board on the dining table and stared at it, a mixture of excitement and dread bubbling within me. I had heard all the stories, how Ouija boards were a portal to the other side, a way to communicate with spirits. But I never really believed in that stuff. It was just a game, right? As night fell, the house grew colder, the shadows longer. I lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting eerie patterns on the walls. I sat down at the table, placed my fingers on the planchette, and took a deep breath. "Is anyone here with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. At first, nothing happened. I felt a bit foolish, sitting alone in the dim light, talking to a piece of wood. But then, the planchette moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it definitely moved. My heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette slowly spelled out a name, Grandpa. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This had to be a joke. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to test it further. "What do you want?" I asked. "Warning," it spelled out, then stopped. A chill ran down my spine. Warning? Warning about what? I felt a sudden urge to stop, to put the board away and forget about it. But curiosity got the better of me. "What are you warning me about?" I asked, my voice shaking. The planchette moved more quickly this time, almost urgently. Danger. I swallowed hard. This was getting too intense. I decided to call it a night and put the board away. As I stood up, the candles flickered violently, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing them. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The room plunged into darkness. In the silence, I heard a faint whisper, like someone calling my name. I spun around, but there was no one there. I felt a presence, a cold, malevolent force that made my skin crawl. I grabbed the board and rushed to my room, locking the door behind me. I shoved the board under my bed and crawled under the covers, my heart racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had let the stories get to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That night, I had the most disturbing dream. I was back in the front yard, digging up the board. But this time, when I opened the box, it wasn't the board inside. It was a rotting corpse, its eyes wide open, staring at me with a look of pure terror. It reached out with bony fingers, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the ground. I screamed, but no sound came out. I felt myself being dragged down, the earth closing in around me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the air thick with an oppressive silence. I glanced at the clock, 3:33 a.m. I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from under the bed. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to get rid of the board, but I was too terrified to move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I felt a cold hand grab my ankle, pulling me towards the edge of the bed. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was relentless. I managed to grab my phone and turn on the flashlight, shining it under the bed. There was nothing there. I sat up, trembling, my heart racing. The scratching had stopped, but the room felt colder, more menacing. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I grabbed the board, wrapped it in a blanket, and ran outside. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I headed to the old oak tree, determined to bury the board and forget this ever happened. As I dug the hole, the wind howled around me, whipping through the trees. I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand. I placed the board in the hole and covered it with dirt, patting it down firmly. I stood up, my breath visible in the cold air. I felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the front door was a figure, tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It watched me, unmoving, as I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. The figure started to move towards me, slowly, deliberately. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground. I didn't stop until I was far away from the house, my lungs burning, my heart racing. I knew I couldn't go back, not after what I had seen. I stayed with a friend that night, too terrified to be alone. The next day, I returned to the house with my parents. I didn't tell them what had happened, afraid they wouldn't believe me, but I knew I couldn't stay there. We moved out a few weeks later, leaving the house and its dark secrets behind. But even now, years later, I can still feel the presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I don't know what I unleashed that night, but I know it's still out there, watching, waiting, and I fear that one day it will come for me. Moving away from that house was supposed to be a fresh start. My parents thought it was just teenage angst or a phase, but I knew better. I left behind not just a house, but something far more sinister. The dreams continued though, haunting my sleep with their disturbing clarity. I could never shake off the feeling of being watched, no matter where we moved. Our new home was a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It had all the trappings of a perfect suburban life, but I felt the darkness following me like a shadow. The first few weeks were uneventful, and I almost convinced myself that the nightmare was over. Almost. One evening, while unpacking boxes in my new room, I found an old journal of my grandpa's. It was buried beneath stacks of old photographs and letters, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. My heart raced as I untied the ribbon and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with Grandpa's meticulous handwriting. Most of it was mundane, recounting daily activities and random musings. But towards the end, the entries grew darker. March 5th, 1978. Today I buried the board. It's too dangerous to keep around, especially after what happened last night. I can't let anyone find it. The whispers are getting louder, and I can feel them watching me. God help us all if it ever gets unearthed. March 12th. 1978. I've been having dreams. Terrible, terrible dreams. The spirits are angry. They want revenge. I must find a way to appease them, but I fear it's too late. The board has a power beyond our understanding. March 20th, 1978. It's not just dreams anymore. They're here. They're in the house, watching, waiting. I can see them in the shadows, feel their cold breath on my neck. I must protect my family, but how? The board must never be found. I shivered, my mind racing. Grandpa had known something was wrong, something deeply malevolent. I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a grave mistake by digging up the board. The warnings were clear, but what was done was done. I decided to visit the old house to see if I could find any clues about how to deal with this. The next day, I skipped school and took a bus to our old neighbourhood. The house looked the same, but it felt different, like a malevolent force was pulsing beneath its facade. I walked around the yard, my eyes scanning the ground where I had buried the board. The earth was undisturbed, but I could feel a presence watching me. As I was about to leave, I noticed a figure standing in the window of my old bedroom. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Gathering my courage, I walked up to the front door and knocked. A middle-aged woman answered, her face kind but curious. "Hi, I used to live here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering if I could take a look around the yard. There's something I need to find." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, come on in, but please be quick. I've got my kids napping inside." I thanked her and headed straight for the backyard. The air grew colder as I approached the oak tree. I started digging, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't take long to uncover the box again. I hesitated, then opened it. The board was still there, but this time it felt different, more menacing. I decided to take it with me, wrapping it in a cloth and placing it carefully in my backpack. I thanked the woman and left, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. On the bus ride home, I felt the weight of the board pressing down on me, as if it were alive and aware of what I was doing. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my room, staring at the box, trying to decide what to do. I remembered the last entry in Grandpa's journal, his desperation and fear. I knew I had to find a way to get rid of the board once and for all. I decided to do some research. I spent hours online, reading about Ouija boards and the supernatural. Most of it was nonsense, but I found a few stories that felt eerily similar to mine. One in particular caught my attention. It spoke of a ritual to permanently seal a Ouija board's power. According to the article, I needed to perform the ritual at midnight under a full moon. I had to gather specific items: a black candle, sage, salt, and a piece of the person who buried the board. The last part sent a chill down my spine. I had nothing of Grandpa's except his journal. I hoped it would be enough. The full moon was 2 nights away. I spent the next day gathering the items, my anxiety growing with each passing hour. When the night finally arrived, I waited until my parents were asleep before sneaking out into the backyard. I set up the ritual space, lighting the black candle and spreading the salt in a circle around me. The air was thick with tension, and the night was eerily silent. I placed the board in the center of the circle, along with Grandpa's journal. I lit the sage and began to chant the words I had found online, my voice shaking with fear. The candle flickered, and a cold wind swept through the yard, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I chanted, I felt a presence growing stronger, like invisible eyes watching me from all directions. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I kept going, my voice growing louder and more desperate. Suddenly, the candle went out, plunging the yard into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. In the silence, I heard a low, menacing growl, like an animal ready to pounce. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed, stumbling out of the circle and falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, looking around wildly, but there was nothing there. The board lay untouched in the center of the circle, and the journal was open to a blank page. I knew I had failed. The ritual hadn't worked, and now I had angered whatever was attached to the board. I grabbed the board and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. I could feel the presence following me, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find another way to get rid of the board, but I was running out of options. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. I was back in the yard, digging up the board, but this time, the ground opened up beneath me, swallowing me whole. I felt myself falling, the darkness closing in around me. I could hear the whispers, growing louder and more insistent until they were all I could hear. I woke up screaming, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and fear. I couldn't focus on anything. School, friends, even basic tasks became monumental challenges. My parents noticed my behaviour, but chalked it up to the stress of moving. They had no idea about the nightmare I was living. Determined to find a solution, I dove deeper into my research. I contacted paranormal forums and even visited an old bookstore that specialised in occult literature. I came across an old tome, thick with dust and age, that seemed to hold the answers I sought. It described a cleansing ritual that was far more intense and dangerous than the previous one. According to the book, I needed to conduct the ritual at the site where the board was first used, Grandpa's old house. The instructions were clear but daunting. I had to perform the ritual alone at midnight and invoke the spirits trapped within the board to confront them directly. Failure to complete the ritual would result in dire consequences, but it was my only hope. The night of the ritual, I snuck out of my house, the Ouija board wrapped in cloth and tucked into my backpack. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way to Grandpa's old house. The neighbourhood was dark, the streetlights casting long, ominous shadows. My heart pounded with each step, but I forced myself to keep going. When I arrived, I climbed the fence into the backyard. The old oak tree loomed over me, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. I set up the ritual space, following the book's instructions to the letter. I lit the black candles, arranged the salt in a precise circle, and placed the board in the centre. As the clock struck midnight, I began the incantation. The words felt foreign and heavy on my tongue, but I pushed through, my voice growing louder and more desperate. The wind picked up, howling around me, and the air grew thick with tension. I could feel the presence watching me, growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the yard into darkness. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I continued the chant. The darkness closing in around me. A low growl echoed through the yard, and I saw shadows shifting, forming shapes that moved towards me. I knew I had to confront whatever was attached to the board. I took a deep breath and placed my hands on the planchette. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out the same name as before, Grandpa. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. Freedom. A chill ran down my spine. Freedom? From what? I took another deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "How can I help you?" I asked. The planchette moved again, faster this time, spelling out Burntheboard. Burn the board. That sounded simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. I nodded, my mind racing. I had to finish the ritual first. I continued the incantation, my voice growing louder and more confident. The shadows around me seemed to retreat, and the wind died down. Just as I was about to complete the ritual, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like a knife twisting inside me. I gasped, falling to my knees. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out HURRY. I struggled to my feet, grabbing the board and the candles. I ran to the old shed at the back of the yard, where Grandpa used to store his tools. I found some lighter fluid and matches, my hands shaking as I doused the board in the fluid. I struck a match and watched as the flames licked up the edges of the board. The fire grew, consuming the wood. and I felt a strange sense of relief. But as the board burned, I heard a scream, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the yard. I stepped back, watching in horror as the flames danced and twisted, forming shapes that looked almost human. The scream grew louder, more anguished, and I covered my ears, unable to bear the sound. The flames grew brighter, almost blinding, and then, with a final ear-piercing wail, they went out, leaving only ashes behind. I stood there trembling, my heart racing. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. I knew I had done it. I had freed Grandpa's spirit and rid myself of the malevolent force attached to the board. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written in the ashes were the words, THISISNOTOVER. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What did that mean? Had I failed? I didn't have time to think as I heard footsteps approaching. I grabbed my things and ran, not stopping until I was safely back home. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to process what had happened. The nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. I knew the board was gone, but the presence was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I realized then that the battle was far from over. I had freed Grandpa's spirit, but something else had been unleashed, something darker and more dangerous. I had to find a way to stop it before it consumed me. The journey was just beginning. The days following the burning of the board were a haze of fear and confusion. The initial relief I felt had dissipated, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The ominous message in the ashes haunted my thoughts. THISISNOTOVER. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to understand what I had unleashed and how to stop it. The nightmares grew worse, more vivid and horrifying. I saw faces in the shadows, heard whispers in the silence, and felt a cold, malevolent presence lurking just beyond my perception. Sleep offered no respite. It was merely a gateway to further torment. I had to do something. Desperation led me to contact a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Harris. Her reputation as a skeptic turned believer intrigued me. If anyone could help me, it would be her. I found her contact information online and sent her an email detailing my situation. To my surprise, she responded quickly, agreeing to meet me. Dr. Harris was an older woman with a calm demeanor and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. We met at a small coffee shop, and I recounted my story, sparing no detail. She listened intently, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. It sounds like you've encountered a particularly malevolent spirit. Burning the board was a good step, but it seems there's more at play here. We need to dig deeper. She explained that certain spirits could attach themselves to objects, people, or places, feeding off fear and negative energy. Destroying the board might have released one such spirit, but it wouldn't simply vanish. It would seek a new anchor. We need to find out more about your grandfather's connection to the board, she said. There might be something in his past that can give us a clue. We decided to visit Grandpa's old house together. Dr. Harris believed that residual energies often lingered in places of significance. If there were any clues, they would be there. I was hesitant, but I knew it was necessary. We arrived at the house in the late afternoon. The air was thick with tension as we approached the front door. The current owners had agreed to let us investigate, provided we didn't disturb anything. Inside, the house felt different from the last time I had visited. It was as if the shadows had grown deeper, the silence more oppressive. Dr. Harris set up her equipment, a series of EMF meters, digital recorders, and a thermal camera. As she moved through the house, she asked questions aloud, hoping to provoke a response. I followed her, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching our every move. In Grandpa's old study, we found his personal belongings still intact, untouched since we moved out. Dr. Harris's EMF meter spiked as we entered the room, and the air grew colder. She motioned for me to sit at the desk. where Grandpa had spent countless hours. "Try to connect with him," she said softly. "Talk to him." I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Grandpa, it's me. I need your help. I found the board, and I think I've released something. Please, if you're here, give me a sign." The room remained silent, but the temperature continued to drop. Dr. Harris checked her equipment, her expression grave. "There's definitely something here," she whispered. Suddenly, the digital recorder crackled to life, capturing a faint, raspy voice. "LOOKINTHEDRAWER." My heart skipped a beat. I reached for the desk drawer and pulled it open. Inside, amidst old papers and knickknacks, I found a sealed envelope addressed to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was written in Grandpa's familiar scrawl. "My dearest grandchild, if you're reading this, it means you've found the board. I hoped this day would never come, but I feared it might. The board is a conduit, a portal to the other side. It was given to me by a man who claimed it could grant me anything I desired, but it came with a price. I used the board, and I unleashed something dark, something evil. I buried it, hoping to contain its power, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way out. You must understand that this spirit feeds on fear and suffering. It cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. There is a ritual, an ancient one, passed down through generations. It requires great courage and a pure heart. You must confront the spirit directly, in the place where its power is strongest. Only then can you banish it for good. Seek out the guardian of the ritual. They will guide you. Be brave, my dear. I believe in you." With all my love, Grandpa, tears welled up in my eyes as I read the letter. I felt a mixture of fear, determination, and a deep sense of duty. I showed the letter to Dr. Harris, who read it with a serious expression. "This is significant," she said. "We need to find this guardian and perform the ritual. It's the only way to put an end to this." The letter didn't provide specifics on the guardian's identity or location, but it mentioned an old family legend about a protector who lived in the nearby woods. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Dr. Harris and I decided to explore the woods the next day, hoping to find clues about the guardian's whereabouts. As night fell, I returned home, my mind racing with thoughts of the ritual and the dangers ahead. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. I found myself in a dark forest surrounded by whispering shadows. Faces loomed out of the darkness, their eyes filled with malice. They reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck in quicksand. A figure emerged from the shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. It pointed a skeletal finger at me and spoke in a voice that echoed in my mind. "You cannot escape. You will never be free." I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat. I knew time was running out. The spirit was growing stronger, and I had to act quickly. The next day, Dr. Harris and I would venture into the woods, hoping to find the guardian and the key to the ritual. The battle was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever lay ahead. I had to be, for Grandpa. The following morning, I met Dr. Harris at the edge of the woods near my old house. The trees loomed tall and foreboding, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. It felt like stepping into another world, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. We had no idea what we would find, but we were determined to uncover the truth. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence enveloped us. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet. Dr. Harris carried her equipment in a backpack, while I clutched Grandpa's letter, hoping it would guide us. We walked for what felt like hours, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on us. Just as I began to lose hope, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. It looked ancient, with moss-covered walls and a sagging roof. A faint light flickered inside, casting shadows on the ground. Dr. Harris and I exchanged a nervous glance before approaching the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and something else, something metallic and sharp. An old man sat by the fire, His back turned to us. He wore a tattered cloak, and his long white hair flowed down his back. "Are you the guardian?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man turned slowly, his eyes piercing and wise. He nodded, his expression grave. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice rough and low. "Your grandfather spoke of this day. You seek to banish the spirit, don't you?" I nodded, clutching the letter tightly. "Yes. How do we do it?" The guardian gestured for us to sit by the fire. "The spirit that haunts you is powerful, ancient. It feeds on fear and suffering, and it has been growing stronger. The ritual to banish it is dangerous, but it is your only hope. You must confront the spirit directly, in the place where its power is strongest. The old oak tree where your grandfather first used the board." He handed me a small, ornate dagger and a vial of dark liquid. "You will need these for the ritual. The dagger is a conduit, a tool to channel your energy and focus it against the spirit. The liquid is a protective elixir to shield you from its influence. You must anoint the dagger with the elixir and draw a circle around the tree. Then, you must summon the spirit and confront it with your strength and determination." I took the dagger and vial, my hands shaking. "What if I fail?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. The guardian's eyes softened. "You must not think of failure. Trust in yourself and your love for your grandfather. That will be your greatest strength." With a heavy heart, I thanked the guardian and left the cabin with Dr. Harris. We made our way back to the old house, the weight of our task pressing down on us. As night fell, we gathered our supplies and prepared for the ritual. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the yard as we approached the oak tree. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the presence of the spirit, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, anointed the dagger with the elixir, and began to draw the protective circle around the tree. Dr. Harris stood by, her face pale but determined. She held a digital recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of the spirit's presence. I finished the circle and took my place within it, clutching the dagger tightly. "Spirit, I summon you!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the night. "Show yourself!" The air grew colder, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the yard. Shadows shifted and twisted, forming the shape of a tall, menacing figure. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a cold, cruel smile spread across its face. "You cannot defeat me," the spirit hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You are weak, just like your grandfather." I felt a surge of anger and determination. "I am not weak," I shouted. "I am stronger than you think. I will banish you once and for all." The spirit lunged at me, but the protective circle held it back. I raised the dagger, my hand steady, and began to chant the incantation from the book. The spirit howled in rage, its form flickering and twisting as it struggled against the barrier. The ground beneath the oak tree trembled, and the wind howled through the branches. I could feel the spirit's power, its malevolence pressing against me, but I held my ground, focusing all my energy on the ritual. As I chanted, the dagger began to glow with a bright, white light. The spirit recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. I took a step forward, the dagger held high, and plunged it into the ground at the base of the tree. There was a blinding flash of light, and the spirit let out a final, ear-piercing scream. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with a cacophony of whispers and cries. I felt a surge of energy like a wave crashing over me, and then everything went silent. When the light faded, the spirit was gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence lifted. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted but relieved. Dr. Harris rushed to my side, her eyes wide with awe. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I had finally put an end to the nightmare. I looked up at the oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, and felt a connection to Grandpa, as if he were watching over me. We gathered our things and left the yard, the weight of the past finally lifted from my shoulders. I knew that the battle was over, but the experience had changed me forever. I had faced my fears, confronted the darkness, and emerged stronger. In the days that followed, the nightmares ceased, and the presence that had haunted me was gone. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, determined to live my life free from the shadows of the past. And though I would never forget the horrors I had faced, I knew that I had the strength to overcome anything that came my way. The spirit was gone, and I was free. For Grandpa. Hey Reddit, I've never been much of a storyteller, but something happened to my family that I need to share. It's been eating away at me for years, and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It all started when I was 16. I was just a regular high school kid, interested in the usual stuff. Video games, hanging out with friends, and trying to avoid homework. But there was one thing that always fascinated me: the paranormal, ghost stories, haunted houses, and all that spooky stuff. One day, I stumbled upon an old Ouija board at a garage sale. It was tucked away in a dusty corner, looking like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wooden planchette was cracked, and the board itself had a strange, musty smell. The elderly woman selling it seemed eager to get rid of it. She practically shoved it into my hands when I asked about it. "Take it," she said, her voice trembling. "Just be careful." I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to scare me. That night, I invited a few friends over to try it out. We gathered in my dimly lit basement, the perfect setting for some spooky fun. We sat in a circle, placed our fingers on the planchette, and started asking questions. At first, nothing happened. We joked around, trying to spook each other, but then the planchette began to move. Slowly, deliberately. We all accused each other of pushing it, but no one admitted to it. The questions started off innocent, names, ages, silly things like that. But then, one of my friends, Sarah, asked if there were any spirits who wanted to communicate with us. The planchette moved to yes. The room suddenly felt colder. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Sarah, always the brave one, asked the spirit's name. The planchette spelled out Lucifer. We all laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But then the planchette started moving faster, spelling out words that didn't make sense. It was like the board had a mind of its own. I was about to suggest we stop when the lights flickered and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, with only the faint glow of the candles illuminating our terrified faces. Suddenly, we heard a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest as I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight. When the light finally flickered on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the corner of the room was a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence filled the room with a sense of overwhelming dread. We all screamed and bolted for the stairs. I was the last one out, glancing back one last time to see the figure still standing there, watching us. We didn't talk much about what happened that night. We all just wanted to forget it, to pretend it never happened. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. Something had followed us home. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the house. It started small, doors opening and closing on their own, strange noises in the middle of the night. My parents dismissed it as the house settling, but I knew better. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, with the feeling that someone or something was watching me. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board at the foot of my bed. I hadn't touched it since that night in the basement, and I knew I hadn't brought it upstairs. My heart pounded as I reached for it, but as soon as my fingers touched the wood, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. I dropped it, my hand tingling, and backed away. The board sat there, silent and still, but I could feel its malevolent presence. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They were skeptical, of course, but I could see the worry in their eyes. My dad suggested we get rid of the board, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be that easy. We threw it in the trash, but the next day, it was back on the kitchen table, as if it had never left. My mum was furious, accusing me of playing a prank, but I swore I had nothing to do with it. Things escalated quickly after that. My little sister Emily started having nightmares too. She would wake up screaming, saying that the man with yellow eyes was coming to get her. My parents were at their wits' end, not knowing what to do. We tried everything, burning sage, calling a priest, even moving to a new house. But no matter what we did, the board always found its way back to us. One night I woke up to find Emily standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and vacant. She was holding the Ouija board, her fingers tracing the letters. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, whispering something under her breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like she was speaking in another language. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the board from her hands. As soon as I touched it, I felt that same jolt of electricity, but this time it was stronger, more intense. I threw the board across the room, and Emily collapsed to the floor unconscious. We rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her. She woke up a few hours later, with no memory of what had happened. My parents were terrified, but they still didn't believe that the board was responsible. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I spent hours researching, trying to find a way to break the curse, but everything I read just made me more scared. The stories of people who had tried to get rid of a cursed Ouija board were all the same. No matter what they did, the board always came back. I was desperate, willing to try anything. I reached out to a paranormal investigator, hoping that he could help. He agreed to come to our house, and as soon as he walked through the door, he knew something was wrong. He could feel the dark energy that surrounded us, the malevolent presence that had taken over our lives. He performed a cleansing ritual, trying to banish the spirit that had attached itself to the board. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling lifted. But then, just as quickly, it came back, stronger than ever. The investigator told us that the spirit was too powerful, that it wasn't something he could handle on his own. He suggested we seek out a more experienced exorcist, someone who specialized in dealing with malevolent entities. But by then, it was too late. The board had taken over our lives, and there was no escaping it. The nightmares became more frequent, more intense. We all started seeing the shadowy figure, its yellow eyes watching us from the darkness. My parents tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We were all falling apart, consumed by the evil that had invaded our home. I felt responsible, knowing that it was my curiosity that had brought this curse upon us. I didn't know how much more we could take. The spirit seemed to feed off our fear, growing stronger with each passing day. We were trapped in a never-ending nightmare with no way out. I knew that if we didn't find a way to break the curse, it would destroy us all. But I had no idea where to start. No clue how to fight something so powerful, so evil. And then, one night, things took a turn for the worse. We were all sitting in the living room, trying to pretend that everything was normal, when we heard a loud crash from the basement. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, and we followed close behind. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we saw that the Ouija board was lying in the middle of the floor, shattered into pieces. The planchette was spinning wildly, as if being moved by an invisible hand. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We heard that same low guttural growl, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I turned, but there was nothing there. We all scrambled back upstairs, slamming the door behind us. My mum was sobbing, clutching Emily to her chest. My dad was pale, his hands shaking. We knew we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed a few bags and left, not caring where we went, as long as it was far away from that cursed board. But even as we drove away, I could feel its presence, like a dark cloud hanging over us. I knew that no matter where we went, it would find us. It would never let us go. That was the beginning of the end, the start of a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. And it was all because of me. Because I couldn't leave well enough alone. Because I had to play with that damned Ouija board. And now, My family was paying the price. Moving into a new house didn't solve anything. In fact, things only got worse. The first night, we tried to sleep, exhausted from the move, but I woke up to the sound of Emily screaming. I rushed to her room, my heart pounding, and found her thrashing in her bed, her eyes wide open but unseeing. She was muttering something under her breath, the same strange language from before. My parents burst into the room, and my dad tried to hold Emily down while my mum prayed desperately. I grabbed her hand, feeling a surge of that familiar electricity. Her skin was ice cold, and her body convulsed as if something was trying to rip her apart from the inside. Finally, she went limp, her eyes rolling back in her head. We were terrified, but there was nothing we could do. The days that followed were a blur of horror. Strange symbols began appearing on the walls, etched deep into the plaster. We heard whispers in the night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread became almost unbearable. We tried to ignore it, to pretend that everything was normal, but it was impossible. One night, I woke up to find my mum standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. She was tracing the symbols with her fingers, her eyes glazed over. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I touched her shoulder, and she turned to me, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. "It's all your fault," she whispered. "You brought this on us." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The next morning, she had no memory of what had happened. She was pale and drawn, her eyes haunted. My dad tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was losing hope, just like the rest of us. Emily's condition worsened. She would go into trances, staring off into space for hours at a time. Sometimes she would speak in that strange language, her voice low and guttural. Other times she would scream and thrash, as if trying to fight off some unseen force. We took her to doctors, to priests, to anyone who might be able to help, but no one could. They all said the same thing. There was nothing physically wrong with her. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. No matter where we went, we could feel those yellow eyes on us, watching, waiting. I started seeing the shadowy figure again, standing in the corners of rooms, lurking just out of sight. It was always there, a constant reminder of the evil that had invaded our lives. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board on my bed, whole and untouched. I screamed, throwing it across the room, but it didn't break. It just lay there, mocking me. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. It had taken over our lives, and there was no escaping it. I spent hours researching, trying to find a way to break the curse. I read about rituals, about exorcisms, about ancient texts that might hold the key, but everything I found only made me more scared. The stories of people who had tried to get rid of a cursed Ouija board were all the same. No matter what they did, the board always came back. I knew I had to find a way to stop it, for my family's sake, for Emily, but I didn't know where to start. The spirit was too powerful, too evil, and it was all my fault. Desperation drove me to seek out anyone who might be able to help. I found a forum online dedicated to paranormal experiences, and there I met a woman named Mara. She claimed to be a medium, someone who could communicate with spirits and banish them. I was skeptical, but I was willing to try anything. Mara agreed to come to our house. She was a tall, slender woman with piercing blue eyes and an air of quiet confidence. She walked through the house, her face growing more serious with each step. "There's a dark presence here," she said, "a very powerful one." She set up a circle of candles in the living room and placed the Ouija board in the center. She instructed us to join hands and close our eyes. She began to chant, her voice low and melodic. I felt a chill run down my spine as the air around us grew colder. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard a low growl, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Mara's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Show yourself," she commanded. Leave this family in peace." The room grew colder, and I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent. I opened my eyes and saw the shadowy figure standing in the center of the circle, its yellow eyes glowing. It was taller than before, more solid, more real. It stared at us, its gaze filled with hatred. Mara's chant grew louder, more desperate. The figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward her. She held her ground, her voice unwavering. "I banish you," she shouted. "Leave this place." The figure reached out a hand, and Mara screamed. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest. The candles flared back to life, and the figure was gone. We rushed to Mara's side, but she was unconscious. We called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. She was gone. I felt a crushing sense of guilt. Mara had tried to help us, and it had cost her her life. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. It had taken over our lives, and there was no escaping it. We were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. After Mara's death, things escalated quickly. The shadowy figure appeared more frequently, its presence growing stronger. My family was falling apart. My mum barely spoke, her eyes hollow and vacant. My dad was a shell of his former self, consumed by guilt and fear. Emily was getting worse, her trances becoming more frequent and violent. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. I spent hours researching, trying to find a way to break the curse. I found stories of ancient rituals, of powerful spells that might banish the spirit for good, but they all required a sacrifice, something I wasn't willing to do. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board on my bed again. This time, there was a note attached. It was written in a language I didn't understand, but I could feel the malevolence in the words. I knew I had to act fast. The spirit was getting stronger, and I didn't have much time. I gathered my family in the living room and told them what I had found. I explained the ritual, the sacrifice it required. My parents were horrified, but they knew we had no other choice. We had to try. We set up the circle of candles again, this time adding symbols and herbs that the ritual required. We joined hands, and I began to chant. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence of the spirit. The shadowy figure appeared in the center of the circle, its yellow eyes glowing with hatred. I continued to chant, my voice growing louder, more insistent. The figure moved toward us, but this time I didn't back down. I held my ground, my voice unwavering. The figure reached out a hand, and I felt a jolt of electricity, but I didn't stop. I kept chanting, pushing through the pain. Suddenly, the candles flared and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a sense of dread. But then, just as quickly, the candles flickered back to life. The figure was gone. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We had done it. We had banished the spirit. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling was gone. Emily's condition improved, and my parents started to recover. For the first time in months, we felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board on my bed again. My heart sank. I knew then that we hadn't truly banished the spirit. It was still with us, waiting, watching. I felt a crushing sense of defeat. We had done everything we could, but it wasn't enough. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. There was no escaping it. I knew I had to find another way. I spent hours researching, trying to find a solution. I found stories of people who had successfully banished spirits, but they all required something I wasn't willing to do. I knew then that the only way to truly break the curse was to make a sacrifice, and I knew what I had to do. I gathered my family one last time and explained my plan. They were devastated, but they understood. We set up the circle of candles again, and I placed the Ouija board in the center. We joined hands, and I began to chant. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence of the spirit. The shadowy figure appeared in the center of the circle, its yellow eyes glowing with hatred. I continued to chant, my voice growing louder, more insistent. The figure moved toward us, but this time I didn't back down. I held my ground, my voice unwavering. The figure reached out a hand, and I felt a jolt of electricity, but I didn't stop. I kept chanting, pushing through the pain. Suddenly, the candles flared and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a sense of dread. But then, just as quickly, the candles flickered back to life. The figure was gone. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We had done it. We had banished the spirit. Or so I thought. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling was gone. Emily's condition improved, and my parents started to recover. For the first time in months, we felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board on my bed again. My heart sank. I knew then that we hadn't truly banished the spirit. It was still with us, waiting, watching. I felt a crushing sense of defeat. We had done everything we could, but it wasn't enough. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. There was no escaping it. I knew I had to find another way. I spent hours researching, trying to find a solution. I found stories of people who had successfully banished spirits, but they all required something I wasn't willing to do. I knew then that the only way to truly break the curse was to make a sacrifice, and I knew what I had to do. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling was gone. Emily's condition improved, and my parents started to recover. For the first time in months, we felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. One night, I woke up to find the Ouija board on my bed again. My heart sank. I knew then that we hadn't truly banished the spirit. It was still with us, waiting, watching. I felt a crushing sense of defeat. We had done everything we could, but it wasn't enough. The spirit was too powerful, too evil. There was no escaping it. I knew I had to find another way. I spent hours researching, trying to find a solution. I found stories of people who had successfully banished spirits, but they all required something I wasn't willing to do. I knew then that the only way to truly break the curse was to make a sacrifice, and I knew what I had to do. I gathered my family one last time and explained my plan. They were devastated, but they understood. We set up the circle of candles again, and I placed the Ouija board in the center. We joined hands, and I began to chant. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence of the spirit. The shadowy figure appeared in the center of the circle, its yellow eyes glowing with hatred. I continued to chant, my voice growing louder, more insistent. The figure moved toward us, but this time I didn't back down. I held my ground, my voice unwavering. The figure reached out a hand, and I felt a jolt of electricity, but I didn't stop. I kept chanting, pushing through the pain. Suddenly, the candles flared and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a sense of dread. But then, just as quickly, the candles flickered back to life. The figure was gone. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We had done it. We had banished the spirit, or so I thought.